Bishop Philip up to speak himself, but I'd like to invite Bishop Philip up to start proceedings tonight. Thank you very much, Bishop.
Thanks, Liam, very much indeed. It's very good to be able to welcome you here to our cathedral tonight. You're very, very welcome for a very important event. We have the Mayor of Truro, and I believe we have the Mayor of St Austell as well. You're both extremely welcome here tonight, and distinguished panellists behind us, Bishop Mark, Ruth Valerio, I see over there. Hello, Ruth, nice to see you. I'm afraid I don't know your names, but I'm sure you're equally wonderful. The strapline of our cathedral here is sacred space, common ground, and therefore I think this is exactly the right place for us to be engaging in the kind of conversation that we're going to be having tonight. This is a sacred space, and within this space we make common cause together on a really important issue. How do we constructively, collaboratively build a better world after the pandemic? And I am absolutely convinced we cannot do that unless we seek to do it in collaboration, constructively together. So I warmly welcome you to this event, and let's listen, let's learn, and on the basis of what we hear and see, let's act. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for such a warm welcome. And it's great to be here. And I also want to welcome you all on behalf of us here and a much broader coalition that is coming together on this important next few days on this occasion of the G7. My name is Ruth Valerio, and I'm Canon Theologian at Rochester Cathedral and also a director at the charity Tearfund. And both from Rochester Cathedral and also from Tearfund, we're really proud to be a part of this event and to be able to join with people of faith calling on the government to take action. We've got a whole range of speakers here this evening, some of whom you can see sitting behind me, and others are going to be joining us online. And we're going to be covering a wide variety of issues, but focusing particularly on vaccines, on COVID, on debt cancellation, on climate, those issues that are so important for us now and that we are wanting our global leaders to be taking action on. We can't all be here. It's lovely to see the cathedral sort of as full maybe as it can be, and even to see it fuller than it would have been at other times during this year. So lovely to see you here, but we know that we're also joined by a whole number of people online from around the UK and probably from around the world as well. So just want to say, whether you are here in person or whether you're watching online, you are very welcome here. And tonight is evidence that people of faith in the UK and beyond expect the G7 leaders to put plans in place for a global and a green recovery that leaves no one behind. And that is what we are calling on here at the G7. We know that we are in a very important year. Boris Johnson has talked about this year being like a golden thread, particularly when it comes to climate. As we go through the G7 and then the G20, we've got IMF and World Bank meetings, all of it culminating, of course, in the COP talks, the UN climate change talks that are happening in Glasgow at the end of this year. So we've got such a key year for us to be joining together. And Tearfund and other organisations here, we're part of a coalition of around 75 organisations called Crack the Crises Coalition, looking for our world leaders to be taking action on the crises of COVID, of poverty, of climate, and of nature loss. And I particularly want to welcome those of you who are here from the Waves of Hope campaign that has been running as part of the Crack the Crisis coalition. If any of you here have got any of your hands of hope, have you got them here? Can you wave them? Can I see any? Oh, one right at the back. Brilliant. Thank you. And sorry for those of you online who can't see. We've had about 800,000 people join together, creating hands, putting them up in their windows, hands of hope that are joining together, and again, calling on the government, this UK government, but the other governments of the world, to be working towards putting together serious plans for a green and a sustainable and a fair recovery. So we are here to reflect together as people of faith and to say to Boris Johnson that the eyes of the world are on him and on other leaders who are with him, that this year is a significant opportunity for us to get ourselves off the damaging track that we have been on that has caused so much poverty, both here in the UK and globally, and that has taken us down this totally unsustainable path. And we have an opportunity to come off that path and to put in place an economic recovery that will put us on a different track. But we are doing this as people of faith. And so I want to ask us to take a moment to pause and to reflect and to commit this evening to God, to the divine, to whoever and whatever is appropriate for the faith that we represent here. For me, as a Christian, my activism comes from being rooted in God, and it's from that rootedness in God that I then turn outwards to the other, and I recognize my rootedness in the whole natural world and in the whole of creation. But whichever faith tradition you are from, I want to ask you to pause for a very short amount of time. We're just going to take a moment's silence, and then we will move on with the rest of the proceedings of this event. Thank you.
but so that we learn to love the whole world in which God has set us. It's great to be with you tonight in Truro Cathedral. Thank you for organising this event. Thank you to Ruth Valerio for producing it. In relation to the G7, surely the place for people of faith to begin is to recognise the scale of the task that's facing our political leaders when they meet here, and to pray for them, to have an honest appreciation of what's happening in our world, to have a sense of urgency about it, and to address the issues with understanding and wisdom. I'll pray that they hear the voices of the poorest and listen closely to what the young people are saying who feel these issues so urgently. There's a relay starting from Cornwall on Sunday to go to Glasgow and COP26 in November. Young people making the direct connection between this G7 summit and what happens at the Climate Change Summit in Glasgow. It's really important to hear their voices. Each of us grows up in a family and a nation. We learn to love in the particular, but not so that we only love our own family, our own nation, but so that we learn to love the whole world in which God has set us. So I'll pray for our political leaders to put away selfish concerns and to work for the world's common good. Perhaps the most important thing that the pandemic has taught us is that we live as people who are connected and interdependent. The earth is our common home. In this time of the virus, no one is safe until everyone is safe. Christianity, like every religion and every ethical system, includes the golden rule: do to others as you'd have them do to you. It's a good place to begin. And because it's universal wisdom, it will help us navigate some of the challenges. So I'll pray for a serious engagement with the global vaccination programme, and I'll pray for the UK government to restore their commitment, our commitment, to overseas aid at 0.7% of GDP. Those of us speaking tonight are properly ecumenical representatives of the world's faiths in one room. In his letter on climate change, Laudato Si, Pope Francis addressed not just Roman Catholics, not just Christians, not just people of faith or of goodwill. He wrote this letter to everyone in the world because we all have a responsibility for the way things are and what needs to happen now. Gus Speth, a scientist who used to be the director of the Natural Resources Defence Council in the United States, he said, "I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse and climate change. I thought 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed and apathy, and to deal with these we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists can't do that." In other words, we need a renewed relationship with God, one another and all creation. It's a profoundly spiritual matter. We're going to need our best thinkers, our most creative scientists and artists, our greatest hearted people, people with the greatest souls, to address the crises which are a moment of judgment as well as a moment of opportunity. We'll need to develop and use the economy, the laws of the house, and the ecology, the wisdom of the house. We cannot depend on techno-optimism to dig us out of a hole, and we will need to answer questions about restraint. What is enough? We can't continue to consume as we do. A new creativity is needed, joyful simplicity. Pope Francis was striking when he said we'll get through the pandemic by caring for one another. That's very apparent in local communities like Salisbury, where I live. People have worked really hard at trying to make sure nobody slips through the safety nets of the community's care. That local experience challenges the way we care for one another around the world. This is a summit that has to make connections. So I'll also pray for a serious engagement with the global economic crisis, for climate justice, and for debt cancellation for the world's poorest nations. This is a time of massive change, and it will not be enough to do better what we've been doing before. We need new world thinking to address the issues that we're facing because of the pandemic, the economy, and the increasingly apparent dangers of climate change and environmental degradation. If caring for one another is what Pope Francis thought would get us through the pandemic, what will get us through the climate crisis, he said, is contemplation. If we contemplate the beauty of the earth and appreciate its loveliness, the loveliness of every living thing, we'll not be able to continue squandering the earth's resources. We live locally and we live globally. Digital technology will help us as communication is being transformed. But we also need to keep on being strongly relational so that we retain our sense of the worth of every person, each made in the image of God. I'll pray for our leaders, but Jesus taught us to pray for what we want. So I'll pray for our politicians to act with a vision of the world as God's love would make it, where peace is built with justice and justice is guided by love. And I'll pray for the inspiration and courage to build it in God's name. Amen.
Namaste and hello everyone. My name is Priyanka Chopra and I'm here with you representing Hindu Climate Action. So Hindu Climate Action is a Hindu response to the ongoing climate crisis, working specifically here in the UK. We want to raise awareness about climate change and its devastating impacts with the whole of our wider community. According to the consensus, there are over 1 million people here in the UK who identify themselves as Hindus. And if we could start conversations in our community about climate change, we could show everyone that protecting the environment is an important part of our worship and practice of Dharma. That's the essence of our work. So let me begin by saying this. Vasudeva Kutumbakam. A quote originally found in the Maha Upanishad and Rig Veda is considered an important verse that guides the Hindu community, meaning the world is one family. And in a time such as this, where there are so many unknown variables, a verse that highlights the importance of why we should all, in our respective faith groups, communities and networks, work together is paramount. Dharma, meaning that which sustains, is a principle that guides us in making sustainable choices, allowing for all beings to flourish. Kindness and selfless actions for the betterment of the world provide us with a sense of purpose and fulfillment, whilst also making the world a better place. And by simply using these philosophies, we can tackle the most important and pressing issues of today. So the pandemic has unearthed the true human impacts which our society have on the earth and climate. We have seen carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels exhibit a 7% drop compared to those of 2019. Yet those people in less developed countries are the ones who feel the impacts of our actions the most. Thus, it's becoming increasingly more important to think about climate change on the global scale in the run-up to G7 and COP26. At COP15 in 2009, developed countries made a commitment to channel $100 billion per year towards developing countries, helping them tackle the damaging effects of climate change. Yet this goal, initially set to be met by 2020, was unfortunately not reached, and a higher goal is likely to be made at these upcoming conferences. This demonstrates a lack of commitment to action being taken by leading global figures. And we may feel like we can't do this on our own, but we can do this as a community. We need to ensure that our leaders are held accountable for these goals, to make sure that everyone in our global family is included in the efforts to recover from the pandemic. And that's why events such as this, opportunities for different faith groups to come together, are so important. Our individual faiths guide us in our work, but like I said a few moments ago, Vasudeva Kutumbakam. The world is one family. So my message to the G7 leaders is this. All of us here tonight are ready to take action in ensuring that everyone in our society recovers from this pandemic. But are you? Thank you.
I'm Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, Senior Rabbi of Masorti Judaism in the UK, a President of the Council of Christians and Jews and a co-founder of Eco Synagogue. Our thoughts and prayers and hopes are with you, leaders of the G7, as we come together as a global family. And Judaism sees us as all together facing the predicaments and challenges of practicing justice and compassion. we look to you as leaders who have significant power at this challenging and critical time in human history. So I'm just going to present a story and a teaching from the Talmud, that treasury of Jewish law and wisdom. The story is told of a group of passengers in a ship, and one of them is making a hole underneath their seat. The others turn to him and say, "Stop it, because we're all going to perish." And the person replies, "But it's my seat. Can't I do what I wish?" Looking at the history of our nations over the last years, we have to ask us whether we are the hole makers or the hole menders. And if we have been the former, now is the time in which we need to become the latter, and urgently, because the fate of so many of the poorest countries, with their challenges of debt, the immediate impacts of global warming, and the poverty caused by the pandemic in countries which have had far less access to the vaccines, are much, much more acute. Can we be the whole menders and carry our responsibility towards the whole family of humankind? The other teaching is perhaps even more chastening. It goes like this. A person has responsibility for themselves. If they don't exercise it, they're held responsibility for what they do. A person who has authority over their family and household will be held answerable for that family and household. As for a person who has influence over a community or a city or a country, they will be held accountable for the deeds and doings of that whole city or country. And a person or a group of people who exercise influence and power over the fate of the whole world will be held responsible for the destiny of the world. With G7 in the UK and COP26 coming in the autumn, our country, together with all nations, shares a profound influence at a critical time over the fate of the world. Does it move towards justice? Does it move towards a sustainable relationship with nature or not? It is in our hands. Thank you.
We see that looking at the high debt levels that Zambia has, which is at the moment over 20 billion United States dollars, we see that a lot of things actually have come to a halt or have come to slow down. One of the things that we see, or the challenges that government has, would be, for example, a number of things that are facing challenges in the social sector. When you look at, for example, the health sector, we see that government began infrastructure development in that sector, but considering that they don't have resources, they have failed to finish off some of essential infrastructure, such as rural health posts and clinics, mostly in rural areas where we have challenges with regarding to access to health. That would be in the health side. And when we come to access to education, again, we have a few secondary schools in most of our rural areas. Now, considering that also government is paying more, spending more on debt repayments, we see that over time, nearly every year, government do not have sufficient resources to allocate to infrastructure development and other areas. Therefore, it becomes more paramount that G7 countries consider debt cancellation for Zambia to help free up resources to ensure that services in the health sector, education, among sectors, I think would actually improve. Because the challenge is that if people do not have adequate access to healthcare services, people are not usually adequately educated, what normally suffers is the dignity of the human person. And also we see that, for example, because of the high debt level that government has been struggling with to settle and repair, we see that even with the coming on board of the COVID-19 pandemic, government actually has been struggling to undertake extensive community screening, and this is where it has become to be more problematic or a problem to deal with, to test many citizens deal with the problem. Considering that this has become a challenge, I think we see that even people's access to quality of care services has been compromised.
Let's take a moment, this moment, to consider why we are here. These words are the beginning of Extinction Rebellion's solemn intention statement and are often read out at the beginning of actions. They speak to a collective. Let us consider why we are here. I stand before you a little sunburnt and blistered. I've been taking part in the Earth March, which has been a walk from Plymouth to the G7 in St. Ives. We've been marching to tell the governments arriving at the G7 that they must treat climate change with the urgency that science demands. We've been marching for climate justice. And we've been marching as a community. We wave our flags together, we sing together, we talk with each other, we walk in solemn silence, and there's a beautiful energy to that. I walk further with other people than I walk on my own. From the other people who I marched with, I was offered wisdom, I was offered strength, and I was offered care. I'm a Buddhist, and many of my environmental actions happen with other Buddhists, often through the form of meditation. We meditate in places you wouldn't perhaps expect. We meditate inside shopping centres. We meditate outside banks. We meditate in Trafalgar Square. I took part in an overnight interfaith vigil outside of Parliament. I sat in a line with other Buddhist meditators in front of a long line of police officers in Parliament Square. And when I meditate in those moments with those Buddhists, with my friends, I feel powerfully connected, not only to them, but to the earth, to the living things on the earth, to the other people at the action, to the samba drummers, to the police officers, to the politicians. We are all connected. But it goes further than that. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a book called Love Letters to the Earth. And in it, he talks about our relationship with Earth. And in addressing the Earth, he says, "You are not outside of me, and I am not outside of you. You are more than my environment. You are nothing less than myself." Climate change is a really difficult problem, and it can trigger feelings of scarcity, of grief. In me, it often triggers feelings of guilt. But when we come together with others, we can offer our strength, we can offer our compassion, and through collective action, hope arises. Thank you.
Hello and assalamu alaikum to you all. My name is Fatima Zahra Alaraka. I'm a 21-year-old fine arts student and also a climate change campaigner with Islamic Relief UK. I'd like to just start by saying thank you to the incredible organisers of this beautiful event for allowing me to share my thoughts with you all today. So, as a Muslim, it's an obligation for me to be calling out injustices wherever I see them. And as we're all aware, the biggest injustice this world is facing is arguably the climate crisis, which doesn't just affect every single human and living being on this world today, but it will continue to do so for generations to come. which is why this crisis is one that people across every single faith group and none need to work together on in order to stop this precious, beautiful world from becoming unlivable. Now, the damage caused by the climate crisis doesn't just stop at an ecological level. It also impacts and exacerbates existing political, social, and economic inequalities and injustices across countries in the entire world. And we've seen how much more detrimental those realities have been since the pandemic has hit. Now, it's very easy to feel hopeless and like what we're doing doesn't create any difference at all, but something that's kept me on my journey in trying to be as good of a steward as I can in this life is a hadith that even during the final hour, if you were to have a seed in your hand, you should still plant it. And to me, that means being as optimistic as possible and always trying our best, no matter the circumstances that we're presented with, to act. And to act no matter how big or small those actions may seem in our eyes, so that we can preserve and protect our green and beautiful world so that we may live abundantly and in the best conditions as possible. So, as a young woman navigating the overwhelming complexities and realities of this world, it becomes increasingly apparent to me that one person truly does have the potential to create a difference. And we as individuals, no matter our age, race, religion, or gender, can all be positive driving forces in this world, so that when we come together as a collective and mobilize others inside and outside of our respective faith groups to join us, we have the power to demand justice and create change in systems for everyone. So we need to decide what difference it is that we want to make in this world, and then be the change that we want to see. So to end, my message to the G7 leaders is finally to put your money where your mouth is and start investing in initiatives to create sustainable greener jobs, housing and spaces that allow for the injustices on social, environmental and economic levels to start becoming a thing of the past. They also need to prioritise real intersectional change in order for any positive, sustainable action to take place, because we can't have true climate justice without social justice. So that means funding groups like those joining today, doing the right work to combat and stop the climate crisis from becoming even more detrimental. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Augusto Zampini. I'm the Adjunct Secretary of the Dicastery or Ministry of the Vatican for Promoting Integral Human Development. The G20, the G7 countries are gathering next week. What do we hope? We hope first that, because they are the most powerful countries on earth, as the parable of the talents teaches us, the more powerful you are, the more responsible you are. So we hope that they use their power as a responsibility, first to ensure the universal access to vaccination. There's no way to fight a pandemic if without a proper vaccination campaign. Some people say nobody's safe until everybody's safe. For that, not just the rich countries need to be vaccinated, but also everybody. The virus doesn't know any frontier, any barrier, so the response to the virus or to the pandemic doesn't need to know any frontier or barrier. Now, how do we do that? Very easily. There's a global mechanism that is called ACT Accelerator, or and the COVAX that belongs to the World Health Organization, with which rich countries can transfer vaccines or money to ensure that poor countries are also vaccinated. So another way of doing is the suspension of the intellectual property rights. If we do that, if the rich countries decide to do that, then we can transfer technology to poor regions of the world that are capable of producing new vaccines. We can transfer the know-how, and if they produce vaccines, we will have a greater possibility to have a universal access to vaccination, or the universal access that we need to fight this pandemic. So very concrete examples of how to use power responsibly. We are expecting your decisions. Second, the cancellation of debt. If you are poor, if you are overburdened with debt, and you need to solve very big problems, you cannot ask for more debt. So the debt has a limit. This is as old as the Old Testament from the Jewish Christian tradition. There's a time that we need to cancel debts and start all over again. So this is at the time to cancel the debt, immense debt of some countries. I know some would say, well, but I have to pay. Yeah, but if we don't cancel the debt, we are preventing the future generations of those countries to develop. So we have to cancel debts to enable the enablers who are going to bring new solutions, a new world. So we cancel the debt so that we can live as one global family together in a healthy planet. And talking about a healthy planet, this is the third thing that we expect from the G7, that they take seriously, very seriously, the commitment to care for our common home, for our Earth. For that, with these political decisions that are needed, difficult, difficult particularly in the short term, but it will be worth it. They will pay off in the long term. Decisions about the just transition towards sustainable economy, towards a sustainable use of energy, and to use all our systems, political systems, the industrial systems, the food systems, the agricultural systems, the educational systems, as part of the ecosystems, not as enemies of the ecosystems. If we can use our creativity as human beings to improve our ecosystems, we will be able to live this world in a better way that we inherited. That's what we should be remembered. Would you like to be remembered the worst ever generation in the history of humankind? I'm sure you don't. This is urgent. It's time to take the decisions to implement the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, and even to move to go further and perhaps implement them fastly. For that, we can do lots of things together. And we are expecting these three things: universal access to vaccine and the suspension of intellectual property rights, cancellation of debts, and the care for our common home urgently, because the home is crying out. We cannot allow this to happen. Our children, our grandchildren would be more than grateful if in history they learned that we did our best to change this course of ecological destruction. Thank you very much. God bless.
Good morning. My name is Sineia do Vale, from the Conselho Indígena de Roraima. I am from the Wapichanas indigenous people. Os povos indígenas têm sido resilientes em várias crises. Uma das crises que os povos indígenas têm enfrentado, e essa crise é global, são as mudanças climáticas. As mudanças climáticas, elas já chegaram nas comunidades indígenas. Hoje elas já têm afetado a vida social, a vida cultural, os seus modos de vida, como a caça, a pesca. Dentre essa questão das mudanças climáticas, tem afetado também diretamente o trabalho com mulheres que trabalham com os artesanatos, quando vai na mata buscar as sementes, que já não dão mais no tempo certo, né? O trabalho com os jovens, que também fazem esse trabalho de artesanato. Isso tudo tem influenciado um pouco na questão das mudanças climáticas junto às comunidades indígenas, não só em Roraima, mas em todo o mundo. Os povos indígenas do mundo todo, globalmente falando, têm sentido essa crise climática através das mudanças do clima. Mas os povos indígenas, eles enfrentam várias crises e eles são resilientes porque têm estratégias. As estratégias dos povos indígenas vêm da sua sabedoria, dos seus conhecimentos tradicionais, do manejo com a natureza, do manejo com a água, do manejo com os biomas, seja ele floresta, seja ele lavrado, seja ele cerrado, né? Seja ele savanas, como tem na África também. Então, em vários biomas que vivem os povos indígenas, tem sido barreira de contenção para desmatamento, tem sido barreira de contenção para a questão de queimadas. Os povos indígenas têm feito o seu papel na natureza globalmente para todos, para que nós possamos respirar um ar tranquilo. Hoje, a outra crise que nos atinge diretamente é a questão pandêmica, a pandemia. O Covid-19, ele chegou de repente em nossas comunidades, levou muitas lideranças importantes que lutavam pelos seus direitos. Eles foram, mas deixaram um legado da luta pelo direito dos povos indígenas em relação à questão da terra, a busca do direito desses povos que hoje mantêm tradicionalmente o manejo das florestas. E esses direitos têm que ser garantidos em todos os países. Quando nós falamos de direito, quando nós falamos das crises que hoje enfrentam os povos indígenas, esses povos milenarmente, com a sua sabedoria, eles têm mantido seus territórios, não só para os povos indígenas, mas para todo mundo, para que eles possam ter um ar que respiram naturalmente, para que eles possam ter uma comida, né, de qualidade, para que nós possamos ter uma vida de qualidade. Ainda temos que valorizar a questão dos povos indígenas em vários pontos. Por exemplo, os países mais ricos que discutem economia, como os países que fazem parte do grupo do G7, deixamos aqui uma mensagem que esses países possam olhar diretamente para os povos indígenas e comunidades locais, assim fazendo com que os recursos destinados à questão dessas crises, seja ela crise climática, crise econômica, seja ela a crise do Covid, que eles possam diretamente chegar esses recursos nas pontas e implementar ações estruturantes para que os povos indígenas possam ter os seus direitos garantidos, para que os povos indígenas possam estar à frente desses temas, levando os seus conhecimentos tradicionais e ajudando o conhecimento científico na busca de saída, na busca de estratégia para enfrentarmos todas essas crises. Os povos indígenas são o guardião da floresta. Eles são os guardiões da natureza. Com a sua sabedoria, têm mantido a floresta em pé. Com a sua sabedoria, têm mantido uma água para que todos possam tomar. Olhando para a questão dos povos indígenas, nós deixamos uma mensagem. Povos indígenas é vidas. Povos indígenas precisamos estar alinhados com a questão da legislação de todos os países. Povos indígenas têm que estar alinhados com a questão do comprometimento dos países quando assinaram o Acordo de Paris. Então, nós precisamos implementar todas essas ações através de políticas públicas em todos os nossos países. Caimém, Manoá.
My name is Jevan Singh, and I'm a British Sikh scholar known as a Gyani. I've travelled and preached worldwide through God's grace, spending time in most of the G7 nations. I currently serve as a senior advisor to 3 of the UK's largest Sikh organisations. But today, I join my esteemed partners from the other major faiths as a Sikh, but mostly as a human being. Please hear us today as sentries, making the call to preserve our collective home with both urgency and integrity. Our evolutionary story in the animal kingdom is one of the survival of the fittest. But this cannot translate to exploitation by the successful. Or else, what separates us as human beings and beasts of the wild? Today, there are nations in the world that are struggling, almost clutching on for their survival. The pandemic has been cruel. It has pushed those in poverty, debt, disease, and war even deeper in anguish. As we emerge from what we can only hope is the tail end of the pandemic, it is vital that we recognize that we are still at sea and the shore is still far from sight. Our journey is a collective one. Dear G7 leaders, our testimony of resilience against the pandemic makes a lighthouse of hope for not one, but the entire human race. It is our responsibility to make sure that our successes remain a source of light to be shared with others. And until every world leader stands together in body, mind, and resolve, we all remain in risk. Guru Nanak Dev Ji, the founder of my faith, said that compassion is the seed of everything good in the world. Access to healthcare, tests, vaccinations, and the provision of foreign aid should not be a means to soft diplomacy or a better image. Instead, compassion alone should give us direction. Compassion is the biggest instrument of development for our human race. Guru Nanak Dev Ji also called this world Dharamkhand, or the plane of righteousness. He and subsequent gurus told us that human life is a blessing amongst all of creation. Through our strength and our intelligence, we have made much of nature subservient to our needs. Plants and animals have become our food. Wood has become timber, oil has become fuel, and even sunlight has become solar energy, and so forth, all serving our needs. The Sikh gurus accepted this as our natural position in the universe. But where does this service become unfair? Where does this service become slavery? Where does use become plunder? As we are not the owners of this earth, this subjugation of nature will come with a price. In the Dharmic faiths, we call this the cycle of karma. We will all pay. The repercussions of the climate crisis and social injustice, science and faith are coming together more so than ever and are making the case of our collective survival. I urge world leaders to take inspiration from the enlightenment of our communities that have had so much apart, have come together and have attained. So world leaders, Guru Nanak Dev Ji said, for a thinker, for a scholar, for someone that makes a change, it is reflection and contemplation that brings them purity. But for a leader, the most important virtue of all is integrity and honesty. And now is the time at G7, at COP26, and at all of the events of this year coming, because our generations will stand witness to what we did in our time, so now is the time to act.
Hello, I'm Andy Norfolk. I was the Pagan Federation media officer for a while. Half a century ago, I was thrown out of a newly opened supermarket. I had been putting stickers saying hazard to the environment on plastic packaging. That was also the year when I began to tell people that I'm a pagan. That was no coincidence. For me, a growing awareness and concern over environmental issues mirrored a growing awareness of the sacredness of the natural world. I had moments of deep and profound realization of the interconnectedness of all things. I explored many religions. Though paganism turned out to be my home, I found much to admire and respect in others, and of course discovered how common it is to have a religious respect for the natural world. Environmental issues have been endlessly discussed over the last half-century and more. Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth and others have done their best to explain the consequences of irresponsible exploitation of the world. David Attenborough has changed the way people see plastic pollution. Greta Thunberg has spoken a very clear truth to power about climate change. Others have contributed too, of course. Satish Kumar has written and spoken eloquently. He said, we depend on the gifts of nature, but these gifts must be received with gratitude and not exploited or abused. The late Duke of Edinburgh helped set up the Worldwide Fund for Nature and the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, though that sadly closed in 2019. Jane Goodall, famous for her work with primates, has run an environmental programme for young people for 30 years. She says she built a strong spiritual connection with the natural world, recognising a spark of the divine in every creature, even the trees. Extinction Rebellion has found dramatic ways to draw attention to the increasing loss of species. These things all matter. We are tearing the life support systems out of our spaceship Earth. As Jane Goodall puts it, when one little species goes extinct, it may seem unimportant. But every time one species disappears, it's like pulling a thread from the tapestry. And eventually that tapestry hangs in tatters, and that can lead to ecosystem collapse. If we continue as we are, the planet will become so damaged it will no longer support human life. The environmental changes that are already happening are beginning to drive mass migration, and this will accelerate hugely if more areas become unsuitable for agriculture or, for example, too hot and dry or flooded to support life. It is in our self-interest to fix the harm humanity has caused, and as people from faiths which believe the world is divinely created, it is surely our religious duty to speak out to make this happen. Greta Thunberg says, "Don't listen to me, listen to the science." She is right, but we should, as people of faith, listen to our hearts and souls too. We too are linked. My soul and your soul are old friends. We should find it easy to share a vision for a better world. People of faith need to find a strong and clear voice on all the issues about which we are speaking here. They are linked. The G7 countries are hoarding COVID vaccines and not sharing them equitably. They have an unfair amount of the world's resources and aren't sharing those. They are creating most of the pollution and causing most of the mass extinction event occurring as we speak. Populist leaders are still surfing on short-term approval and ignoring long-term challenges. The poorest nations are suffering most. This cannot go on. We must speak out for a fairer world to be created after the pandemic, because the unfairness that exists now is not sustainable and will drive climate and environmental catastrophe. We are at a critical time. We have wasted half a century, but there is hope that we can make the right changes. The G7 conference must make those changes reality now.
Hello, I'm Davina Bacon. I'm a student at the University of Exeter's Cornish campus, and I study English and environmental science. I'm also an environmental justice activist. I just want to thank CAFOD and the Cathedral for organising this event. I think it's really important that we as people of faith come together because we make up such a significant part of the population, and we're a voice that the government will have to listen to. So I'm involved in campaigns with Christian Aid and the Young Christian Climate Network, or YCCN. YCCN is a group of Christians across the nation who are aged between 18 and 30, who believe that the climate crisis is both the cause and result of injustices against people and the planet. We're currently campaigning for world leaders at the G7 and at COP26 to do the right thing when it comes to responding to the effects of the climate crisis and deep injustices we see across our world today. This means doing things like restoring the foreign aid budget, doubling the climate finance commitments of rich countries, and cancelling the debts of the poorest countries so they can prioritise responding to the climate emergency and rebuilding from the pandemic. We've been organising a relay walk from Carbis Bay, where the G7 is being held, to Glasgow, where COP26 will be in November. It's open to everyone of any age or belief, and I think one of the interesting things is that across faiths, a lot of us have traditions of pilgrimage. So yeah, I'd really encourage everyone to get involved in your local bit. As people of faith, many of us see advocating for the poor and marginalized as key practice. For example, I'm a Christian, so if we look at the life of Jesus, he said so much about speaking truth to power and the forgiveness of debts and being radically generous and hospitable as part of the way of life in the kingdom of God. So as faith communities, we have a responsibility to call for urgent and drastic action in light of these values, both in our local areas where inequalities exist, Cornwall being a key example of this, where some of the most deprived neighbourhoods in the country are just miles away from this expensive conference and holiday homes and things. And also as faith communities which extend beyond national boundaries to encompass those who are already being heavily impacted by the climate crisis. The thing is, science and technology aren't going to save us. Of course they are important, and we should take advantage of the ways we can lower our emissions, but we can't rely on it when so many of the causes of climate change are linked to systemic injustices. We need to listen to those most impacted, those from the global south, and let them lead us. One thing I love about campaigning with other people of faith is that this responsibility does not feel like it might all be for nothing in the end. We have this hope that is beyond ourselves, which we can share with the rest of humanity, a hope that allows us to reimagine our world as a better place, one where we care for our environment in a way that allows for the flourishing of all beings, all creation, all humans, no matter their gender, race, class, nationality, and so on. So as a collective people of faith, our message to the G7 leaders is this: when you are making decisions, remember with compassion those who have been made vulnerable by some systemic injustices, those who haven't been given a seat at the G7 table. We need you to do the right thing with your power. So cut emissions, stop investing in fossil fuels, redistribute resources to those we have exploited and those facing the worst consequences of the climate crisis. And let's create a better world. Thank you.
As the local Catholic bishop, Bishop Mark, based in Plymouth, I want to offer a word of thanks to the Lord Mayor and the civic authorities locally for the generous response they're making to the challenges of this time, and a word of thanks to Bishop Philip and the Christian community here at Truro Cathedral for facilitating this evening, and a very big thank you to CAFOD for enabling us to gather in this way. In a monastic community, one young monk was asked to assist his elder brother in being able to make his way to chapel each morning for morning prayers. He arrived 10 minutes early to find the older brother already sitting outside his room, gazing over a field. The next morning, the young monk came 20 minutes early to find the older man in the same place. And so each morning, again 10 minutes earlier, until by the end of the week, the young monk was coming an hour earlier to find his elder brother sitting outside still gazing over a beautiful field. And so the young monk said to his older brother, "Father, why is it when I come so early to gather you for prayer, you are already sitting outside, no matter how early I come?" And the old monk replied, "My dear son, before going to praise the Lord in the chapel and in the book of his word, I must praise him in the book of his creation." Many of us who've gathered this evening, physically here in this lovely cathedral, or virtually online, are people of faith. We desire to protect God's beautiful creation and to care more fully, more generously for our brothers and sisters who are less well off than us. We join with people of no faith and with people of goodwill who hold with us that the earth is our common home. It is entrusted to the whole human family to be protected and passed on to future generations. We come together, indeed we stand together, to try and listen more attentively to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. It is, of course, the poorest of our brothers and sisters who experience disproportionately the negative impact of the exploitation of the earth's resources. The global pandemic has taught us that we are all in the same boat, to use that poignant phrase of Pope Francis. One person's problems are the problems of all. We have an obligation to ensure that every person lives with dignity and has sufficient opportunities for his or her integral development. Each of us is called to take concrete steps in the circumstances of our own lives, from reducing consumption to working for change to better care for our world. Care of our common home is not only a summons to profound interior conversion, but also a call to a community conversion. It's to be a lasting change of heart. We need to encourage individuals of all ages to take their own personal action in solidarity with the poorest and most disadvantaged. Religious leaders are particularly called to be at the service of this fraternity in our world. And that's why it is so good that we have come together tonight to speak together this evening. We must find other occasions too to speak with one another and to act together for the common good and the promotion of the poor. You will know that Pope Francis has called for the development of a global community of fraternity, a world where dignity is valued and respected through concrete actions is not just a dream, but a path to a better future. So my dear G7 leaders, my brothers and sisters too, we welcome you to our beautiful part of the world. We hope that having spent some days here, you may go on to work more diligently for the care of our common home and for the dignity of the poorest of our brothers and sisters. We pray that you seize this opportunity to convert the current model of global development and its focus on growth and consumption into a model more respectful of creation and the integral human development of all present and future peoples. For ourselves, we pray that we may care for our common home, may care for all our brothers and sisters, with a greater love for all that the Lord has created, and to praise him in all that we behold. Thank you.
Bishop Philip, Bishop Mark, your Lordship, thank you very much to everyone for joining us tonight. If you would like to send a message yourself to the G7 leaders about the world that we want to build after the pandemic, then please go to cafod.org.uk/G7card, and there's an opportunity to send a message to the G7 leaders yourself. But thank you once again, everybody, for joining us tonight. And let's hope and pray that the G7 leaders do indeed put in place plans to build a better world after the pandemic. Thank you very much.